Did you know that nearly 80% of school shooters have a history of trauma before they ever pick up a gun? Welcome back to We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling. School shootings have become part of the national dialogue in America, with much of the focus on weapons and security measures. But today, I want to shift the lens in this conversation to something that doesn't get nearly enough attention: childhood trauma and how it connects to the mental health crisis underlying these violent acts. When a school shooting happens, we rightfully debate gun control, security measures, and even the cultural forces that are at play. But there's another dimension here. What is going on in the years that lead up to these violent acts? What happens in a child's life that drives them to bring a gun to school and turn it on their classmates? I came of age during the Columbine school shooting. One of my close friends went to Columbine High School, and even though she had graduated by then, it left such a profound mark on me that my dissertation was on the relationship between emotional childhood maltreatment and perpetrating bullying as an adolescent. I wanted to understand what causes someone to commit that level of violence at such a young age. Which is why today we're going to examine the long-term effects of childhood trauma and how it intersects with the kinds of violence we see in schools. What would it look like if we intervened earlier, if we could catch the signs of trauma before it's too late? I want to start by making a disclaimer. We are not wrong in America to focus on gun control when these school shootings happen. I am not making the case whatsoever that the solution to mass shootings lies in managing mental health. That may sound weird for a therapist to say, but I say it because America doesn't have a monopoly on mental health issues. Mental health struggles are prevalent all over the world, and still no other country has the number of mass shootings that we have in the States. So, even though today's topic is on how childhood trauma can morph into something more complex, certainly more dangerous, especially when it's combined with a lack of mental health resources, nowhere am I stating that the cure is in managing mental health alone. This is a yes and proposition. We can talk about both things because we have to. So let me begin by saying that the research I did to get my PhD confirmed that there is absolutely a strong correlation between having childhood trauma and becoming a bully as a teenager. And subsequent studies of school shootings and youth perpetrated gun violence widely shows that bullying is one of the behavioral red flags that is correlated with gun violence. Kids who perpetrate violence are not born violent, they are created, which means the first place we need to start is by clarifying what childhood trauma is. Now, most people think that childhood trauma results from overt physical or sexual abuse, which is fair, that is true. But I want to broaden your understanding of other things that can cause childhood trauma, things that are less known. Childhood trauma happens when a child experiences emotional or physical distress that overwhelms them. It overwhelms their ability to cope. This can come from direct experiences like with abuse, and it can also come from what we call indirect exposure, like witnessing violence or substance abuse in the household. It can also come from emotional neglect, where a child's emotional needs aren't met. If you have caregivers who are physically present but emotionally distant, maybe due to their own mental health or substance abuse issues, or maybe it's just their own unresolved trauma or the stress that they're experiencing, where they're not able to provide the child with the affection, the attention, and the emotional validation that they need, the child can suffer trauma. What I want you to know is this: not all abuse and neglect will result in trauma. And also, some things that are less obvious can and do leave a child with trauma. So, why does childhood trauma lead to violent behavior as a teenager? The first thing I want to tell you is that the teenage brain is still developing. It is very much a work in progress. The part of the brain that is the slowest to develop in humans is called the prefrontal cortex. And that is the part of the brain that is very much under construction when you're a teenager. The prefrontal cortex controls our impulses. It's the part of the brain that allows us to draw from our past experiences as we make future decisions. It allows us to contemplate the consequences of what our impulses are driving us to do. It's one of the reasons why, even though teenagers are in adult bodies, we don't give them freedom that we give adults because they're reckless. They act first and they think later. Now, we know that suffering childhood trauma predisposes you to violent behavior throughout your life. It makes you more prone to engage in violence even when you have a fully developed brain. So think then how that affects the teenage brain, which is already compromised because it's still developing. Kids who experience trauma often develop hyper-reactive fight or flight responses, making them more prone to aggression as a coping mechanism for perceived threats or for dealing with emotional pain. We know that prolonged experiences of stress also impacts our ability to manage our emotions, which makes it hard to process and tolerate negative feelings like anger or fear or sadness. When trauma goes untreated, these feelings can manifest as outward aggression or violence as a way of coping with overwhelming emotions. We have a tendency to overlook the role of early emotional abuse or neglect when we're faced with school shootings. Emotional abuse, like exposing a kid to constant criticism, humiliation, or rejection, as well as emotional neglect, like consistently failing to meet a child's emotional needs, those are less visible than physical or sexual abuse, but can be just as harmful to the child's development. These types of trauma often go undetected because there are no physical marks, and society tends to downplay the emotional harm and think of it as less significant. What I need you to know is that there is a cumulative impact. Emotional abuse and emotional neglect often occur over long periods of time, creating a sense of worthlessness, inadequacy, and isolation. Kids who grow up without emotional support or who experience things like chronic invalidation, they're at high risk of developing mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and aggression, which can play a role in violent behaviors later on. And it leads to difficulty managing anger and pain. Early emotional abuse and neglect disrupts a child's ability to regulate emotions effectively. That means manage emotions effectively. Without the tools to process their emotions in healthy ways, kids are prone to acting out in aggressive ways to cope with their internal turmoil. Also, when you're chronically neglected, you don't see better examples of managing emotions. Kids are like little sponges. They learn from their environments. And if the examples in your life normalize aggression as a response to distress, or if there's no one around to run interference when you're reacting inappropriately to distress, you never course correct. I remember when I was in PhD school doing my research, I was really curious to understand why bullying was so tolerated by parents and schools. Everyone I talked to kind of gave me this eye roll when I would launch into one of my tangents on the importance of changing our culture of tolerating bullying. And I would often be met with, this is just kids being kids. Everyone gets bullied. We all lived through it. It's like a rite of passage. And one of my responses was to say, kids in America are actually legally required to go to school, at least through age 16. And in no other environment would we tolerate people being emotionally or physically abused, which, by the way, is what bullying is. And again, going to school is something that kids can't opt out of. Can you even imagine going into the office and having to tolerate a culture where people are openly aggressive to you and there is nothing you can do to protect yourself? HR kind of just shrugs it off and says, hey, coworkers are going to be coworkers. The way schools say kids are going to be kids. It is preposterous. It would never happen. Not today. And we had laws protecting against workplace harassment in the aughts when I was in PhD school. We Need to Talk is sponsored by Mindful Care. You might remember my friend, Dr. Tamir Aldad, from a few episodes back. He just texted to let me know that Mindful Care is now accepting new patients. We all know how hard it is to find an in-network psychiatrist without a long wait list, but Mindful Care can see you same or next day for medication management, recovery, and group therapy. No wait. And they take Medicaid, Medicare, and commercial insurance. Visit mindfulcare.com or text or call 516-505-7200 to book your appointment today. So part of the reason why bullying is so prevalent is because adults minimize the impact that it has. I'll tell you this, most of the clients I meet who have a history of being bullied in school have residual trauma from it. And it then becomes part of the trauma reprocessing that I have to do with them, that they have to pay me for. And it is completely unnecessary. Because despite the fact that schools historically say that there's nothing that can be done to end bullying, that is bullshit. My first job out of graduate school, I worked in a small private school that had a strong anti-bullying culture. They made it their business to get involved and run interference the minute they got a whiff of bullying. And there was virtually no bullying in that school. I am still close to some of those kids who went to that school, and they continue to tell me that there was basically no bullying. So just to put a period at the end of this, bullying can only exist in a culture that tolerates it, and cultural norms are nothing more than shared expectations, values, and beliefs and behaviors that we all consider acceptable and typical within our society. We do not have to tolerate bullying as a norm, because kids who go on to perpetrate gun violence in schools were often perpetrators of or victims of bullying. And like most problems in life, it actually doesn't get better by ignoring it. If you want to do something years before a kid ever picks up a gun, insist that their school adopt an anti-bullying culture. When there's a school shooting, our tendency is to label the shooter as a monster, when it turns out they were kids who needed help and never got it. We are missing the bigger picture by only seeing the act of violence and not asking, how'd they get there? Look, just ask yourself this question. Does a kid who brings a gun into school strike you as emotionally healthy? Of course not. You don't need a PhD to answer that question. These are kids who are more likely than not victims of childhood trauma. In hindsight, we can always identify the warning signs that parents and schools missed. So here come the 7 biggest warning signs that a student is in trouble that could lead to a school shooting. Fixation on violence. An obsession with weapons, violence, or mass shootings is a huge red flag. It's the biggest red flag. A fascination with guns, with collecting or talking about firearms, maybe writing or drawing firearms, or creating content in school that glorifies violence. Maybe they're not doing it just in school. Maybe they're doing it online. Expressing admiration for or studying previous shooters, often referred to as Columbiners. These are huge red flags. Second most common indication that we have someone whose emotional disturbances could lead to a school shooting: social isolation and withdrawal. What we know is that many school shooters are socially withdrawn or isolated for a long period of time. They struggle to form meaningful connections with their friends. They tend to avoid social interactions or appear to have no close friends. Next, we have threatening behavior or communications that the person engages in. So making direct or indirect threats of violence, either verbally or in writing or online, significant warning sign. Some perpetrators have posted alarming content on social media. They've made threats against specific individuals or discussed plans for violence. And in many cases, these threats were dismissed or not taken seriously. expressions of extreme anger or grievance. Many shooters harbor deep resentment or anger towards others, often feeling wronged or bullied themselves or mistreated. They tend to talk about getting back at people or at society for perceived injustices. This sense of grievance can evolve into violent fantasies of revenge. Next, we have a history of being bullied or bullying others, and we've already covered that. Mental health struggles. Many perpetrators of school shootings have experienced untreated or poorly managed mental health issues, including things like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, which is thinking about suicide, fantasizing about suicide, or other emotional disturbances. And while mental illness alone doesn't cause violent behaviors, untreated mental health struggles can exacerbate feelings of hopelessness and anger. Leakage of intent. So in many cases, perpetrators leak their intentions to others before they commit a shooting. This could involve confiding in a friend, posting cryptic or overt messages online, dropping hints about their plans. And as we all know, these warnings are often dismissed or not reported. So what real-world actions can schools and communities take to prevent trauma from turning into violence? Obviously, we need to make mental health services available to kids who are in trouble. The problem is, how do we identify them so that they don't slip through the cracks? Here comes the most basic idea imaginable. The same way we administer standardized tests to ensure that schools are consistent in the level and quality of education that they're providing, we can administer a standardized test every year to every student that would flag kids who have a predisposition to childhood trauma, who have some of the warning signs that they may already be experiencing trauma. Now, the gold standard that we use to measure trauma is called the ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire. It asks 10 questions. You could literally take it in place of gym class one day, and it would flag kids who are at risk for trauma. It is that simple. This is not rocket science, folks. This is very basic stuff. We catch the kids who are at risk, and then we start by giving them access to mental health services, because it's not the trauma itself that predisposes kids to perpetrating gun violence. It's childhood trauma combined with a lack of mental health resources that puts them at risk. So if we give them support, we lower that risk, period. At the end of the day, school shootings are a very complex problem, but they are not unsolvable. We can't prevent every tragedy, but we can do a hell of a lot better to intervene early by addressing childhood trauma and the mental health struggles that often go ignored. When we look at the warning signs, the emotional distress, the history of bullying, and the lack of support that these kids face, it becomes crystal clear that they didn't just snap. They were created by environments that overlook their pain. If we really want to stop this epidemic of violence, we need to take action long before guns come into play. We need schools and communities that prioritize mental health, recognize trauma, and refuse to tolerate bullying. And yes, we need systems in place to catch kids in distress early when there's still time to offer them help and hope. So what can you do? Push for trauma-informed practices in schools. Advocate for mental health resources that are accessible to every student. And start by treating emotional struggles as seriously as we treat academic ones, because the real solution lies in creating environments where our kids feel seen, heard, and supported. That, my friend, is how we end this cycle. We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling is a Sterling Standard production. Editing and sound engineering by Bart Miguel. Our theme music is by Trending Music. Special thanks to Amanda Christiani and Preston Smith. If you know a guidance counselor, a school principal, or any school employee, you can be part of this solution by sending this episode to them. We'll be back on Tuesday with another episode packed with the relationship, dating, and mental health hacks you've come to expect. References, as always, are in the show notes. We'll see you soon.